While the Roman Empire does not officially begin until 27 BCE, the Roman legacy began much earlier than that. The Etruscans, who were the original inhabitants of Italy, were there by 700 BCE, and the Romans, another faction in Italy, had conquered all of Italy by 89 BC. So there's a long history here. The Romans are extremely important to Western civilization. Many have said that they are the greatest civilization that we have ever seen. One thing that is interesting is that the Romans did copy, I'm doing air quotes here, the Greeks, in that they took over a lot of their art, their literature, their sculpture, and made it their own, but it was still very uniquely Roman. Four particular characteristics of the Roman people that will be important to us are gravitas, Gravitas, which is seriousness of purpose and a sense of responsibility. Pietas, Pietas, duty and devotion to others. Dignitas, Dignitas, a sense of self-worth. And virtus, Virtus, manliness, courage, and character. So as we go throughout this chapter, I think that you will be able to see all of these, gravitas, pietas, dignitas, and virtus, exhibited in the character of the Roman people. Some contributions that the Romans made to our society today are that they built the road network of modern-day Europe. As already noted, they were very serious, and so they were serious in their architecture and in conquering all of the known world. They saw themselves as rulers of the world. They thought that was their destiny, to rule the world. And in that, it was important that they have an infrastructure. So they built the road network. They developed the alphabet that we use today. They developed the 12-month calendar we use today. They did spread Greek art and culture, as I mentioned earlier. They also spread Christianity, which came to be during the time of the Roman Empire, and they laid the foundation of modern-day government. So there is so much that the Romans did that impacts our world today. The Etruscans were the forerunners of the Roman people, and they were established by 700 BC in Tuscany, which is in the northern part of Italy. And perhaps they came from the east, maybe Lydia in Asia Minor. Archaeologists are not sure exactly, but they have traced them back to an area in Asia Minor. And so they migrated south to Italy and developed very rich artistic traditions there. It's not like they were a lesser group of people before the Romans came. They were a very rich civilized society in their own right. Their art is a little different. It is less interested in proportion and more in the impact that it makes on the viewer, and you'll see that pretty soon. They established an urban center in contact with the outside world. Now, this urban center that they established was a marshy area that was there in northern Italy, and it actually became the Roman Forum, which was the main area in the city of Rome where all of the government action took place. And so it's, pretty important that the Etruscans developed that. And they did have contact with the outside world. They were not a loner society. They trade with the East, trade with the West. So it was a very civilized group of people. Here we have a statue from the Etruscan period, and this is Apollo of Veii. Called Veii because that's the name of the town where it was, and Apollo after the god, the Greek god Apollo. It was not discovered until 1916, and it's known for its smile there. Notice that it is a little bit like the archaic smile in chapter 2. Here the Romans thought it was very sinister. And so that's what it is remembered for. It was presumed to have come from the roof of a temple, and it currently resides at a museum in Rome. The burial practices of the Etruscans were similar to the burial practices of the Egyptians, in that they constructed elaborate mausoleums, or like little houses, for their dead. And what the Etruscans did, the the mausoleums were full of normal, ordinary things like the people would have had, and it was constructed to be very similar to the living environment that the person or the people had on life. So you had carvings of kitchen utensils and carvings of things that would have been found in the home. And then you would have the coffin, which is called a sarcophagus because we have a sculpture on top. And the sculpture would be of the person or the people whose ashes were in that coffin. It is interesting that this society cremated their dead and buried the ashes in the mausoleum. So here, the lid of a funerary urn, the ashes of these people would be in that urn. This is a different sculpture than what is in your textbook. Your textbook on page 121, you see another sarcophagus, and you appear to have a younger couple there. Here it appears to be an older couple, but what is interesting is that we see how much women were a part of the society, that women seem to have a larger place in the Etruscan society than they did with the ancient Greeks. In this slide, we see a sarcophagus from a young man who had died. I thought that was interesting because it's just one person and he is younger. And then we also have a fresco. A fresco is a painting that is done on fresh, wet plaster so that the plaster becomes part of the painting itself. Here you have two dancers, a little different than what you have in your textbook on page 121, where you have the Etruscan scene of fishing and fowling in your book. Here we have two men, and what I think is interesting is that they don't have the perfect bodies that the Greeks had, and so that is something to note. Rome officially began as a republic long before it became an empire. And as a republic, it was governed by the people along the same lines as the governance was done in the Greek city-states. You had two chief magistrates or consuls who were elected for a one-year term by all the male citizens, but the main bodies of government were the Senate and the plebeians. Now, the Senate is composed of patricians, and those are aristocratic families, the wealthy people in town who were, it was passed down along family lines, and they did control most of everything. But there also was an assembly with the plebeians. The plebeians were the lower class Romans, and they had their own assembly, and they were not influential for many years until the Hortensian Law was made. And that eventually did make decisions of the plebeian assembly binding, and that was in 287 BC. Both groups of people met in the Forum, and the Forum is what I talked about earlier, that marshy area that is in Rome, that where the governing bodies met. And so both the patricians and the plebeians were instrumental in Republican Rome. The Roman Empire spread very quickly. By the 1st century BC, the entire Hellenistic or Greek-speaking world was conquered. And they were conquered in a series of wars called the Punic Wars, named after Poeni, which is a Latin word for Carthage, and that was the main town that the Romans had to defeat in order to conquer all of the Hellenistic world. And it was 3 different wars, and they did conquer, and then they spread from Spain to the Middle East in the 2nd and 3rd centuries. And so they spread all of that Greek culture, and then of course the Roman culture as well. The Romans were known to have a very hardened Roman character. They were much more concerned with conquering the world than with governing it or than with art and literature. They were warriors. I mean, they were fighters and of course had the best military to be seen. A change started happening a little later with the rise of the middle class called the Equites. And then we'll get to in just a moment the civil wars that developed among the leading statesmen that caused the decline of the Roman Republic and the birth of Imperial Rome. Here is just a slide of the Roman Forum, so you can see the ruins of where the Senate and the Assembly met during Republican Rome. Republican Rome was characterized by a number of very diverse types of literature, as we see on this slide. First, we have Ennius, who was the father of Roman poetry. He wrote a work entitled Annals, which is an epic chronicle of the history of Rome. Plautus and Terence were both comic playwrights who fashioned their comedies after the Greek Aristophanes. And Plautus was the one who was more successful, and probably because he was more farcical. He had more slapstick comedy, more, we would say, dirty language or whatever it was called in their time in his plays, and he was more successful with the people. And then Catullus, who was a male, who was a lyric poet, much like Sappho with the Greeks. And you remember Sappho, the woman poet who expressed her feelings. Here we have Catullus, a male poet, and a Roman male poet. In a time period where it was all about fighting and war, he expressed a lot of the emotions that he felt in his poetry, and we will look at some of that. The most noted political figure during Republican Rome was Julius Caesar. He was elected military tribune at age 28, which means he was a leader of the plebeians. So he came from the lower class, and the tribunes were the leaders of the plebeians. So he was elected there at a very young age. He served several other offices in Rome before going to Gaul. And when it says here offices, what is meant is in the army. So he had several, official military posts in Rome before he went to Gaul, which is the Germany, France region. He conquered most of Central Europe, so he was well respected as a fighter, as a warrior. He led the first Roman crossing of the English Channel, so he actually left continental Europe and crossed over to England, which was unheard of. And then he was elected consul. Remember that in Republican Rome they elected 2 consuls? He was elected the consul of Rome in 49 BC. We know so much about Caesar's military exploits because he wrote about them in a book called Commentaries. And you can see an example of that in your textbook, page 125. And he goes into great detail about these military campaigns, and so what he left us was so noteworthy. He conquered Egypt and established Cleopatra as an ally, which comes into play later. He was named the Dictator Perpetuus of Rome in February of 44 BC, and then he was assassinated in the Senate by conspirators Brutus and Cassius, March 15th, 44 BC. If you've never heard of the Ides of March, I-D-E-S, it's from Shakespeare's play called Julius Caesar, and he says, beware the Ides of March, because that is the day that Julius Caesar, who was presumably their best military warrior and the best political leader in Rome, that he was assassinated by his friends in the Senate. Roman sculpture differed a little bit from the Greek sculpture in that we have several of these busts, and these busts that are done are called portraiture, like a portrait with U-R-E on the end of it, because they were like a portrait of the person. The person who was being sculpted could tell the sculptor how he wanted to appear, and it was mainly men. Did he want to appear thoughtful or authoritative or kind, sincere? And Caesar, of course, wanted to appear very authoritative, and so this bust was done of him around mid-1st century BC. Cicero was a leading figure in Republican Rome. As you see here, he was a lawyer involved in many important legal cases. He was elected consul in 63 BC, so about 20 years before Caesar. And in the triumvirate, where we had 3 people who were vying for power, Cicero supported Pompey over Caesar, and he really didn't think much of Caesar. The letter that he wrote about Caesar is not in this textbook. It was in a previous edition, and he did write many letters about his daily life and helped us to understand Republican Rome because of what he wrote. But in one of his letters, he had dinner with Caesar, and he just talked about how he was not impressed, how, it was an okay evening, but he certainly was not going to do it again. Here is the bust that was done of Cicero, and it too is considered portraiture, just like the one of Caesar. And here Cicero appears very thoughtful, authoritative, but not in a bad way, very much like a kind judge. Two major schools of philosophy developed in Rome from the ancient Greeks, and one was Epicureanism. Epicureanism that says the goal of human actions is pleasure. This came from Epicurus, who lived from 341 to 271 BC. They rejected a divine force in the world. They had no belief in an afterlife or in immortality. And most saw Epicureanism as something that came more from the Greeks because they saw the Greeks as very self-indulgent with no discipline because they had no hardened army. And they believed that the world was made of atoms and empty space. And they got a lot of this from the Greeks. And most Romans didn't look kindly upon the Epicureans. There were probably only about 15% of the Romans who were Epicureans. Most Romans were Stoics, and that makes sense with what we know about the hardened Roman character. The Stoics believed the world was governed by reason, that the divine providence watches over the virtuous, and one is determined virtuous because he desires only what is under his control. In other words, a slave won't desire to be the master. They will stay in their own station. They did believe that suicide was okay, was sanctioned, but the Stoics liked that hard ascetic life. They believed that riches, power, and health were under a person's control. So a person was able to decide for himself what his life was going to be like, except he couldn't move out of his station. But as far as his health and his riches, they didn't believe in that Greek idea of the gods made me do it. Seneca, who was a leading Republican philosopher of the time period, was a Stoic. The science of law is one of the few original creations of Roman literature, and that is represented by the Jus Cavalii, which is something that Caesar wrote. It was a single unified code of civil law created by Caesar. It didn't reach its final form until 533 AD by Justinian. So you see how long it lasted, and really it forms the basis of our law system today. It was used in Europe for several centuries, and Caesar, so much came from Caesar, and Caesar was the one who wrote the Jus Cavalii. After Caesar's death, there was a lot of upheaval in Rome. It boiled down between two men, Mark Antony, who was Caesar's lieutenant, right-hand man, and Octavian, who was Caesar's great-nephew. They both thought that they should inherit the title that Caesar had. So for 13 years, they fought it out, back and forth between the two established allies. And one of the allies that Mark Antony established was with Egypt. Remember that Julius Caesar first had established Egypt as an ally? So Mark Antony continued that, and he was together with Cleopatra, and she was helping him in this fight against Octavian. So finally, it came to a head at the Battle of Actium, Actium. At the Battle of Actium, they fought, and Mark Antony and Cleopatra were routed, and when they saw that they were not going to win, they committed a double suicide, according to legend. They had an asp, a very poisonous snake, the asp who they allowed to bite each of them, and so then they died together. And Octavian was left as the sole ruler in 31 BC. He changed his name, assumed the title of Augustus, and so he was Caesar Augustus, and that was the end of the Roman Republic, and he ushered in the golden age of Rome, kind of like the golden age of Greece, and it's called the Pax Romana, which means the Roman peace. When Augustus became the emperor of Rome in 27 BC, he ushered in what is called the Roman peace, or Pax Romana, that lasted for almost 500 years until 476 AD. When Augustus first became the emperor, he said that Rome was still going to be a republic. He said that he replaced the state in the hands of the Senate and the Roman people. However, he did exactly the reverse. He placed the power in his own hands. And so he is the first emperor, but when he first became emperor, the people didn't really realize that he had that much control. But he was a very good emperor, and he ushered in a lot of cultural achievements that could not have been achieved unless war was absent, unless Rome was at peace, because it needed its men to do a lot of things. For example, the army was changed, and the character of the army, they became engineers and they built roads. They sowed crops, and so agriculture improved. They surveyed the countryside and they built the aqueducts. So much that came because Rome was at peace and they were able to do these other things. Virgil was a writer during the time period of Caesar Augustus, and first he wrote Georgics, which is a practical guide to farming, cattle breeding, beekeeping, growing blueberries, very practical. But then he was commissioned by Augustus to write an epic for the Roman people. Augustus felt like they needed a history, they needed something to root them, the same way that the Greeks had the Iliad and the Odyssey. And so Virgil then wrote the Aeneid. It was the national epic of Rome, and some scholars have said that it really is not as good of a piece of literature as the Iliad and the Odyssey because it was written for pure propaganda to prop up the Roman state. It is composed of 12 books, 6 that were based on the Iliad, 6 that were based on the Odyssey. The theme of the work is responsibility, that a person doesn't do what he does for himself, he does it for others, for the good of his country. And that is a very Roman characteristic. And Aeneas, who of course is the epic hero of the work, is seen as a man of destiny. One of the best examples of Augustan sculpture is the Ara Pacis, and this was how Augustus wanted to see his reign viewed. The Ara Pacis means altar of peace, and Caesar Augustus had it dedicated to peace and in honor of his wife Livia, so that they could have future generations that would continue and with the stability of the family. This sculpture is closest in style to classical Greece because of the frieze that goes around it. So we can see classical Greek motifs in that frieze around the top of the sculpture. And the scene that is being depicted here is of Aeneas from the Aeneid, Aeneas who is sacrificing, and we also see an abundance of nature, and there is a procession that is making its way to the sacrifice. Aeneas is on one side of the altar, and Romulus and Remus, who are the legendary founders of Rome, were on the other side. You can see several depictions of this in your textbook on pages 142 and 143. Another very important piece of sculpture during this time period was the sculpture of Augustus himself. It's called Augustus of Prima Porta, and in it we kind of see a combination of the classical Greek sculpture plus the portraiture of the Romans, because we see very clear facial features on Augustus. He is depicted as having a very calm, determined authority, but then we also see some of the musculature that we saw in the classical Greek statues. Here you can see what is depicted on the south frieze of the Ara Pacis. We see Augustus leading the way in a procession going to a sacrifice, and it is inspired by the Parthenon in ancient Greece, but we do have very recognizable figures here from Rome of that period. The best preserved statue of the emperor himself. It dates from the time of his death, and you see here that calm, determined authority I mentioned earlier, and you see his breastplate and his spear, so it shows him in battle. You see the Cupid that is riding a dolphin that is down at his feet. This is the Cupid, the dolphin is a symbol of Venus, a connection to Aeneas that looks to the future with his grandson Gaius. Pompeii was a city that was south of Rome, and a lot of the Romans went there to vacation. They went there on holiday. It's near the sea. It was a nice town to go visit. However, there was a volcano there in the Bay of Naples, and the volcano erupted on August the 24th in 79 AD. So the volcano was called Vesuvius, and it erupted and it caught people in mid-flight as they were fleeing the city. So many of the victims were perfectly preserved by the lava, and their homes were preserved, their temples, everything there was perfectly preserved. And this is how we know so much about life in first century Italy, is because of this eruption in Pompeii. And we have a man there called Pliny the Younger, and the journals that he wrote serve as an eyewitness account to what occurred that day. And everything, his journals, plus the excavations that took place and that are still taking place, showed that the first century Italians had a very comfortable, cultured life, and we've learned a lot about their life because of this volcano eruption. This is one of the buildings that was preserved from the volcano with the lava. This is a wall painting in the Villa of the Mysteries, and they are unsure exactly what this building was used for. This part of the painting is G-rated, but if you look online, there are portions that are not. It appeared that in this building, women were prepared for marriage, that other women were there to teach them how to please their men and what they would be doing during marriage. One thing to note from an artistic point of view is the fact that look how red that is. I mean, you've got to keep in mind there was not paint, that they used berries and natural elements to make this mural. But this mural all the way around shows just the level of their artistic exploration. While there are Roman temples that were built to honor the Roman gods and goddesses, much of Roman imperial architecture was dedicated to the military. It memorialized all of the many military exploits that the Roman army had made, and arches in particular were used to commemorate military victories. There was just the simple arch, the tunnel or barrel vault arch, and then that made way for the dome. And the domes were used on many of the most important buildings in ancient Rome. We will look at some of those in a bit. The invention of concrete is credited to the Romans, and it was this particular feat that enabled them to build the buildings like the Pantheon, and the Colosseum. This invention of concrete was so important, and you'll get to do a discussion post on this a little later. But they also invented the principles of stress and counter stress so that they knew how to build so that they could have the arch, they could have the dome, because of learning about these principles of stress and counter stress. Here's just a quick reminder from the previous chapter about the different types of columns that were used in the Greek and now the Roman temples. Remember, we had the Doric columns, the Ionic, and we are going to add the Corinthian columns to our list. As a reminder, the Doric columns are those that are simple and grand with no base. They taper to the top, and then at the top they have the capital with two parts. And remember that the Ionic columns are the ones that are more graceful and elaborate. They have that tiered base, and at the top they have the capital with the pair of spirals or volutes. Now we are adding to our list of columns the Corinthian columns. The Corinthian columns were invented by the Romans, and they were the most decorative of the three types of columns. They were used with buildings with flat roofs. And look at the capitals. The capitals have so many flowers and leaves, very decorative, and specifically these are the leaves and flowers of the acanthus plant, which was indigenous to Italy. Look at the columns themselves. They're very smooth, so they don't have those indentions like the Doric and the Ionic. Most of Imperial Roman architecture was destroyed in the 5th and 6th centuries by the barbarians when they invaded Rome. But the Parthenon did survive. And the Parthenon is one of the most well-known buildings in the world. You see that it was built in about 118 to 125 AD, and is known in particular for that dome. That dome at the very top has a little round circle that is cut out, that is open to the skies, and it's called an oculus, which means the eye. so that you could see out, and that's its most distinguishing feature. It was built by the Emperor Hadrian. Notice the Corinthian columns in the front. And then we have the obelisk. There are obelisks all over Rome, which are this structure here that looks in the very front, that is very tall and slender, very much like the Washington Monument. These were modeled after Egyptian pieces of architecture. So you know the connection with Egypt and Rome, and so you can understand how that came about. This is an aqueduct, and this is one of the things that the Romans were most well known for, in the fact that they built this all over their empire so that these aqueducts would bring fresh water into the towns and the cities. This is one that was built in France called the Pont de Garde, one of the most well maintained of the aqueducts, because it's not in ruins as you see here. And we'll talk in class a little bit about how these aqueducts actually worked. Hadrian was one of the more well-known emperors of the Roman Empire, and he built Hadrian's Wall, which is a wall across the northern part of England and into Scotland. It marked the boundaries of the Roman Empire in northern England. You see when Hadrian was emperor, 117 to 138 AD, and it was during this time period that he built it. And it's really quite amazing that this wall that was built then is still standing today. Here's an example of one of the Roman cities that was built in northern England. You can see the same kind of structure that was used on the Hadrian's Wall. Here you have, these are actually latrines or bathrooms that were built over the creek there, which was pretty forward thinking for the ancient Romans. And here in the bottom picture you have these rooms that were used to hold the grain, the granaries, and it was just an amazing feat that the Romans during this time period were able to do this, and that these cities are still there today. This is probably the most well-known building in all of Rome. This is the Colosseum. It was built in the late 1st century by the Emperor Flavian, so it's sometimes called the Flavian Amphitheater. It is an amphitheater like we had with the ancient Greeks, where you have the staging area in a small circular area at the bottom with where the spectators would sit as it rises up. So this is an amphitheater, and the way it was constructed was that so they could have all sorts of activities there. One thing they did was they had mock ship battles. They would flood it, and they would have the ship battles, and then they had an elaborate system of drains that could drain all the water out. And then for their next activity, they might have a gladiator fight. So they would haul in tons of sand and put it in the staging area, and then the gladiators would fight, and the sand would soak up all the blood. And so then they could haul all the sand out. Now, why were they having all these activities? To entertain the emperors, to entertain the wealthy people, the aristocrats. The emperor actually was trying to keep the people satisfied, and so he would stage these events and bring in all of the wealthy, important people so that they would be entertained and that they would support him. And got to remember, this is in the time period when the Roman Empire is failing. It's close to the end, and the Colosseum is mainly seen as a picture of just the degradation of the Roman Empire because of the gladiators who were slaves in conquered parts of the empire who were brought in to fight, and how they had gladiators fight lions and bears. And this is that famous Colosseum where the early Christians were fed to the lions. So there is so much that is associated with this building in Rome. Emperor Constantine is the most important emperor of late antiquity, so towards the end of the Roman Empire, that he is so important because of all the many things that happened during his reign. He was proclaimed Augustus by his troops in July of 306, and then one thing he did that really most scholars say was the beginning of the end was he moved the capital of the Roman Empire from Rome itself to Byzantium or Constantinople, and he rebuilt the city and he called that the New Rome. So he moved it to the east, and that changed the entire character of the Roman Empire. And most scholars now say that he laid the foundations of medieval European society. Constantine converted to Christianity in the year 312. There are some who say it was a true conversion, and there are others who say that he did it for political reasons, because at this time Christianity had really gained a foothold in the Roman Empire. We really have the beginnings of the Roman Catholic Church here. And so the old religions, the polytheistic religions, were really going by the wayside, and Christianity was becoming the religion of the empire. He issued the Edict at Milan in 313, which declared the Roman Empire to be neutral to religious worship. Okay, now that's important because it paved the way for Christianity. He said, first of all, they were going to be neutral, and then he convoked the Council at Nicaea, which is credited with beginning the Roman Empire's unofficial sponsoring of Christianity. And then later, in the year 325, he declared that Christianity was the religion of the Roman Empire, and so he, in effect, established the Roman Catholic Church. He is also most well known for building St. Peter's Basilica in Rome, which of course is where the Pope is and is still there today, and the Church of the Holy Sepulchre, which he said he built on the site of where Jesus was buried, and that is in Jerusalem. One thing that Constantine did to unify his kingdom, which had spread so far to the east, was he had statues of himself all over the empire. And these statues were very large. This is the bust of Constantine, and this head was inserted either into a standing statue or into a seated enthroned statue. The head itself is 10 feet high overall, so you can imagine how large either the seating or the standing image here of Constantine is. Notice the very Eastern look. We have the large eyes are that Eastern influence, and then the way the hair is done looks very Eastern, so you can see that how the Roman Empire is changing. This was sculpted 1 year before he founded Constantinople, and it really harkens back to some of the earlier Greek statues that were done of the gods. This is the last great imperial building in Rome. It was begun by Maxentius and then finished by Constantine about 300 AD. The rest of it collapsed during antiquity. This is all that is left, but you see the arches, very Roman. This originally was an assembly hall. It was built to show the emperor's authority. It had a 30-foot statue of Constantine in it. And it has a very Eastern motif, not the classical Greek one that we are accustomed to seeing. The traditional date of the fall of the Roman Empire is 476 AD, when the last emperor, whose name is Romulus Augustulus, was deposed. But most scholars say that the power had already shifted 100 years earlier when Constantine moved the capital east. Because of that, there were problems with the growing power and changing character of the army, because the army played a large role in choosing the emperor. Well, the army became larger, they recruited more foreigners, and these people did not have a loyalty to Rome. They had never been to Italy, they didn't know much about it, because the empire has shifted east. So with this changing army, they are choosing different emperors that don't really have a loyalty to Rome and to how the Roman Empire started. So these non-Roman emperors really hasten the fall of the Roman Empire. Also, there were threats from the outside. Barbarians from the west, Persians from the east, who were all attacking the Roman Empire from all areas. And then, to pay for all of this fighting, the Roman Empire increased their taxes at the same time while their currency was depreciating. And when they increased their taxes, it made trade impossible. The standard of living declined. And to try to help that, the emperor became more authoritative, and that just made things even worse. He set himself up as a semi-divine figure, which the people revolted against. So we have that, and most say also the declining moral character of the Roman Empire, that led to their downfall as well. Late Roman art and architecture is very different from the early. Remember that the earlier style mimicked what had been done in Greece, in ancient Greece. And the ancient Greece art, along with the Roman art, that's called the classical style. Well, those styles were abandoned. The portraiture that had developed during the Roman Empire was neglected. There was no depth in the relief carvings. Remember how we had high relief and low relief? And the high relief were the 3D statues, and even the low relief, the figures stood out from the stone. But now there's no depth with that, some lack of perspective and precision. And most say that this very much foreshadowed the Middle Ages. Here is a frieze from the Arch of Constantine, and here the emperor is in the middle and he is distributing money to the crowds. It's a very simplified style, and very much the people look like puppets. It's very different from the past, and it foreshadows the future. And one thing that's changing as well is, with the classical style, we do have the pagan art with all the different gods and goddesses, but Christianity has brought an end to that, and pretty much all of the artwork going forward is going to be based on the new, I'm doing air quotes here, the new Christian religion that has been established during the Roman times.